Hey folks, today we're going to discuss the issue of divine hiddenness. This is probably amongst the top 2 or 3 arguments used by atheists as their basis for why they don't believe in God, specifically why they believe a God cannot possibly exist, and how natural explanations for the universe explain the world that we live in better. There are a number of problems with the divine hiddenness argument. There have been others who have attempted to rebut the argument. And so I don't want to claim to know all of the rebuttals, but this channel focuses on the logic of arguments. It focuses particularly on the logic of arguments with respect to understanding the nature and existence of God, understanding Christianity. And so I will be focusing on the problem with the argument from divine hiddenness as it pertains to logic. This is a philosophical argument. It's reasoned philosophically. It's reasoned through syllogism. And for at least 2 primary reasons, the argument is fatally flawed. It's not a good argument. It doesn't survive logical analysis. And we will get into why. And we'll do that by exploring 2 videos by 2 of my favorite YouTube atheists. One is Alex O'Connor, and the other one is, if you had to take a guess, I bet you couldn't guess this, but if you know any of my other videos, you would know it is Paulogia. I really respect both of these gentlemen. I think they do a fantastic job with presenting counter arguments. They do a fantastic job with holding claims up to scrutiny. They are, I believe, honest. And in fact, what we're looking for when we're trying to engage in debates like these, I should say at least what I'm looking for, is honesty in the debate. It's what I also try to bring. And so what I like about Alex and Paulogia is that they attempt to the best of their effort to steelman arguments from their opponents as much as possible. In my opinion, again, that is the most persuasive way to deal with an argument that that an opponent is making. So they do a really good job of that. I'm going to try to do that here too, so I want to be clear. But I'm going to show, even with the steelman argument, there are 2 fatal flaws with the argument from divine hiddenness. The first is that it's an ontological error. It's a category error, where we're attempting to discuss the nature of a God of a hypothetical world that doesn't exist, instead of the nature of a hypothetical God of the world we actually have. And I'm going to get into that. And the second is that it is a syllogistic fallacy. It's an invalid syllogism. And we'll see that it presents premises that may be true. And for our argument, especially steelman, and then we'll accept those premises as true, but those true premises don't necessitate the conclusion that atheists draw from them, and so the syllogism is invalid. Now, as I said, there are other arguments that have been put forth by apologists and others against the argument of divine hiddenness, focusing on motives or focusing on whether or not there truly is a person who could be a non-resistant non-believer. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to accept the atheist premise that there is such a thing as a non-resistant non-believer. I actually believe that, and so I'm not going to argue against that at all. And I'm also not going to attempt to psychoanalyze anyone. This focus will be entirely on the logic of the philosophical argument and why that logic shows that the argument necessarily fails. So with that, let's kick off the discussion by looking at a video from Alex O'Connor.
Far from being unable to escape God, there is a very real contingent of non-believers, and I would count myself among their number, who are unable by any means to discover him, who seek and do not find, who knock and receive, as it were, no answer. This strange phenomenon is known as the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God, then simply, why is he hidden from so many of us so much of the time? If theism is to offer a sufficient account of reality, then it must offer an account of what J.L. Schellenberg has famously labelled non-resistant non-belief, which he distinguishes from resistant non-belief. It's sometimes said by a theist who wishes to explain the problem of divine hiddenness that people simply disbelieve through their own fault. They're too stubborn. They're purposefully blinding themselves to the evidence because they don't want it to be true. They're not approaching the arguments honestly with an open heart, and that if they would only do this, then God would surely reveal himself. Such a person would be what Schellenberg calls a resistant non-believer. He disbelieves, in some sense, because he actively resists it. For what it's worth, I do think that such people exist. I think many such people exist. There are people who come to this debate with their minds already made up. There are people who want it not to be true, that God exists, and in fact wouldn't submit to that truth even if it were true. There was a recent poll run by the Atheist Experience YouTube channel, which I know, Jonathan, you're a fan of, which asked, if there was a God, would you worship it? To which an astonishing 85% of respondents said that they would not. There are, however, also people who disbelieve in God, not out of resistance or stubbornness or a hardened heart, but rather due to sheer lack of conviction. Indeed, many such people actively want to be convinced of God's existence and would jump at the chance of entering into a relationship with him if they thought that he did. But no matter how hard they search, they simply find no answer forthcoming from the heavens. And this is the non-resistant non-believer.
Okay, while I don't want to jump the gun here, since we'll be covering this in detail shortly, I do want to point out that we already have a syllogistic error presenting itself here. Alex says that if theism is to offer a sufficient account of reality, then it must offer an account of non-resistant non-belief. As appealing as this statement may be, and even accepting it as true that theism must offer such an account, and again, we're going to get into that later, but we'll accept that for the sake of argument. We'll see in a bit why merely demonstrating that a single explanation for theism failing to do this doesn't invalidate myriad or even infinity other potential explanations. But as I said, we'll get to that in a bit.
Believer. Formally, then, Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness can be stated as follows. Premise 1. If there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with. Premise 2. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists, and the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God. A loving God, like the Christian God, would surely not refuse any willing person from developing a relationship with him, and so if somebody is truly non-resistant and open to receiving God's grace, we should expect them to receive it.
Okay, so we'll just pause here really quickly because Alex lays out the syllogism that he's using, and we'll take a second here to walk through it, and then, as I said, we'll cover this more in detail in a little bit. So, premise 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. Okay, we'll accept that premise. No controversy there. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Again, we'll accept this as true for argument's sake, but it's important to point out that it's not necessarily true, as we'll discuss. However, it's also not necessarily false, and we'll talk about why that's especially important in a bit. So we should entertain it as a not false premise chosen from potentially infinity other, not necessarily false options. Additionally, this is also the first clue to the category error that we're going to be discussing a bit later. That is, assumptions about what a hypothetical, non-existent world should look like, rather than dealing with the world that we actually have. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. As I said, we'll accept this. Premise 4, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists. We'll come back to why this conclusion is invalid, even though we've accepted the first 3 premises as true in a bit. And premise 5, therefore, there is no God. Okay, so you could argue these kind of collapse into each other. Alex is going to go on to state a case for why non-resistant non-belief is real and how he's a non-resistant non-believer. But because I've stated at the outset that we're not debating that, we're not contesting that, and in fact, I actually do accept that as true. I won't show it all here. I may show a little bit of it, in bits and pieces throughout the rest of the video. But what I want to do now is switch to Paulogia and have Paulogia give his version of the same issue.
This one is from Inspiring Philosophy, and Mike Jones, friend of the channel, fan of his TikTok, and we've had discussions both online and off many times. Like the guy, but he and I will always disagree on the notion of divine hiddenness. So it caught my attention when he was on Pints with Aquinas discussing that very thing, divine hiddenness. Let's brace ourselves. What does Mike have to say about my favorite topic, or the topic about God, which influenced me the most?
How do you respond to the hiddenness of God? This argument, and I'm not going to you can still man it for me, but the idea being, if God exists and wants me to be saved, and I need to accept that salvation in some capacity, then I need to first at least know that he exists.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is an important point. And when I had my recent conversation with Kurt Jarris, for example, I was trying to establish this. So most Christians, while they disagree on a great many things, when they think about it, will agree with me that there are at least two parts to God's salvation plan for his believers. So first of all, if they get some kind of intellectual assent to something, now Christians will disagree, but there needs to be some kind of intellectual assent, at very least, that God exists and that this God has authority over us in some way and that we've wronged that God in some way. There needs to be, step one, intellectual assent. Step two, some kind of heart/mind, emotional life response to that. So there's the intellectual assent. That's not enough, but it is a prerequisite. Part two is a response, a personal response to that intellectual idea. So because of this two-step system, no person can merely accept, they can't jump to step two, right? You need the intellectual assent. You need the intellectual acknowledgement before you can respond. So if anyone out there is like me, for whom it does not seem like a God exists, I don't believe a God exists, I believe the Christian God does not exist, depending on how you want to label it, I am not at the intellectual assent part. Therefore, I'm not even capable of doing step two, right? Until I reach that intellectual assent, I can't accept or reject God. That's an important part. So if this God wants to have a relationship with me, and even worse, if this God is intending to base my eternal fate on my emotional response to the intellectual assent, I need to at least have the intellectual assent. So the idea of the argument from divine hiddenness is that if there are non-resistant non-believers, meaning a non-believer who would move on to phase two if they could get to phase one, if there's even a single person like that in the world, in history, for whom, if they had the intellectual assent, would make the appropriate response, then God has created a problem. Then we do not have a God that is all benevolent, or we do not have a God that wants to save me. There's some flaw in a God that would allow that scenario, that would seem to negate the descriptions of the Christian God, okay? And that's where I am at on divine hiddenness. I've examined myself as far as I can tell about myself. I am a non-resistant non-believer. I was a believer. I wanted to stay a believer. My faith was ripped from me against my will. I am open. If I come to once again believe that the Christian God exists, I will immediately follow. I will immediately accept whatever minor lifestyle changes that involves for me. No worries. That's a small sacrifice for me for this eternal life. So I am boldly putting myself in that non-resistant non-believer camp. Therefore, for me, and for me only, because no one else can psychoanalyze me, know my heart, know my mind, for me, that is sufficient evidence to say that the Christian God does not exist. It's not proof for you, it's not proof for anyone else, but it's proof enough for me.
Paulogia says this is the topic that influenced him most in his path away from Christianity and toward atheism. I believe he says later that this, along with gratuitous suffering, are his primary arguments against God. And the same is also true for Alex. So it's important enough of an issue that we need to dedicate some serious analysis to it. And by extension, gratuitous suffering, which I've covered elsewhere and for which the same logical constructs apply. Paulogia argues that to get a relationship with God, first there needs to be some intellectual assent that God exists. I'll accept that. And then step two, there needs to be some personal response to that assent. Again, we'll accept both of those premises. But his argument is that you can't reach step two without getting past step one. And Paulogia argues that if this hypothetical God wants humans to have a relationship with him, there shouldn't be a single non-resistant non-believer in the world. If there's even one, then God can't possibly be all benevolent, all loving, etc. The Christian concept of God. Again, there's a category error here as well as a syllogistic one, and we'll discuss it in short order. But Paulogia goes on to say that his faith was ripped from him against his will. And so while this is not the point of the video, and I've touched on this a bit elsewhere, this one particularly hits home to me pretty hard. I relate to it on so many levels, and honestly, it saddens me. This isn't pity for Paulogia. I don't think he would want that. But it's sad when anyone has anything they care about taken away from them against their will. So again, back on topic, I have no reason to doubt, and in fact, I accept that Paulogia is a non-resistant non-believer. So for the purposes of this video, we'll skip over the parts of the discussion where they're dealing with the question of whether such a thing is even possible. I accept that it is, and I take Paulogia at his word when he says he's a non-resistant non-believer. So Paulogia doesn't provide as clearly an articulated syllogism as Alex did, so I'll attempt to do that for him because I think it's pretty straightforward, and it's certainly implied. So in Paulogia's syllogism, premise one is something like the following. 1. If the Christian God loved me and wanted to have a relationship with me, a non-resistant non-believer, he would reveal himself in a way that would persuade me of his existence. So again, for argument's sake, we'll accept this as not necessarily false. Again, it's not necessarily true, but since it's also not necessarily false, we'll accept it and move on. Premise 2, that this hypothetical Christian God hasn't provided me with evidence sufficient to persuade me that he exists. And so since for Paulogia he holds this as true for him, he argues that this invalidates a Christian God because all that is needed is a showing that this is true for even one person, and he argues that it's true for him. So again, we'll accept this premise as not necessarily false, as we must, and even potentially true. So no argument here, we'll move forward. Then premise 3 is, therefore, the Christian God can't possibly exist. Again, this is an invalid conclusion, similar to the one we discussed earlier with Alex, even if we accept these first two premises as true. So let's discuss why. This is an example of when two premises can be true and the conclusion might also independently be true, but the premises don't necessitate that conclusion. So it's an invalid syllogism and it's a logical fallacy. So in fact, it's both a category error and a syllogistic fallacy. So first, let's just deal with the category error. It's a category error, specifically an ontological error, where we're attempting to discuss the nature of God of a hypothetical world by using a world that doesn't exist instead of the nature of a hypothetical God with the world we actually live in and know. And so these can be subtle and they're easily missed. They're usually of the variety of something like, if there really was a God, we wouldn't see suffering or crime or babies dying, etc. And so what these arguments try to do is state what the world should look like if God exists, but that is not how the problem needs to be approached. What we have to do is take the world as it is and see if there are arguments for how the world could be the way it is now and there also be a God. Because there are potentially infinity hypotheticals about alternate worlds that could have any number of, again, infinity characteristics to them. And so postulating them really doesn't tell us anything useful and is, for the most part, invalid ontologically. It's more precise to say that it doesn't tell us anything useful. So turning to the syllogistic problem here, and also Alex's syllogistic problem, the issue is that the premises could be true, but they wouldn't be the full universe of possibilities for how a loving Christian God in this world would behave. So as humans, and given the natural world we exist in, we can't ever truly know what the nature or characteristics of a hypothetical God would be, ranging from totally impersonal, hands-off God all the way to personal. And so even if we accept for the moment that a God is at all possible, which for the purposes of this discussion, we must accept that, we can't assume that such a God, given this world, would only have one specific set of characteristics. And so what we actually have to do is state what we postulate as being the Christian concept of God and the necessary characteristics that we postulate such a God would have. And so long as those characteristics are not necessarily false, for the purposes of our analysis, we can see if those characteristics fit with our natural world. In this way, we avoid both the syllogistic error and the ontological one. Again, it's super important, so I want to emphasize we don't have to demonstrate that those characteristics are necessarily true. All we have to show is that the characteristics are not necessarily false, and then we're permitted to draw our own analyses based upon them. And so, while there's no uniform agreement as to what characteristics the Christian concept of God must have, I think it would be fair to say, and certainly for the purposes of this analysis, that the Christian concept of God should have at least the following three characteristics. Characteristic number one, that God would be all-loving. Characteristic number two, that God would be a benevolent, good God. And characteristic number three, that God would imbue humans with free will. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, we will not even try to validate the first two premises, a loving God and a benevolent God. We'll accept those. There is some disagreement about whether or not free will, even exists, and if it does, whether or not the Christian God necessarily must impart human beings with free will. And we'll take a quick stab at defining it in just a second. But again, the point is, as long as it's not necessarily false that humans could have been imparted with free will by God, then for the purposes of this analysis, we must accept it. So if you don't understand that, then you should pause the video and take some time to think about it, because that is a critical point here. The difference between what is necessarily false and what is necessarily true. With respect to free will, it is its own conversation for its own entire video. There are a number of problems with both the philosophical concept of free will and the scientific concept of free will, or lack thereof, scientific concept of determinism. There are those who argue that free will is impossible, it's scientifically impossible. There are problems with those arguments. This isn't the place for that. What I can say definitively is that there are no falsifiable arguments that show that humans do not have free will. There's never been a falsifiable argument put forth that says we're not permitted, because of science, to entertain the possibility of free will. And so for our purposes, since it's not necessarily false, we must accept it. Now, as far as what free will is, for this discussion, we'll just define it as I believe Alex O'Connor has done elsewhere, which is the possibility to have acted differently. Again, this is its own conversation and don't want to bog down on this point, but the idea is that for a given set of choices, a person could have chosen a different choice if either they were able to rewind back in time, or when presented with the fork in the road, they could choose to go left instead of right, and that they themselves could actually make that choice. Essentially, this is an important concept for most Christians because this is the concept that makes coming to God a choice, a matter of one's ultimately conviction. Many Christians, and I include myself squarely in this camp, believe that one of the greatest ways that God shows his love for humankind is to give us true and unbridled free choice. God allows us to choose freely what actions we will take, what beliefs we will hold, what evidence we'll choose to consider, etc. This is, for me, so foundational that if I didn't believe this, I could not be a Christian. Of course, this also means that humans can choose to do bad things, and humans can choose to do things that wouldn't please God. That has to be true if God truly imparts us with free will. And so just quickly to wrap this particular section up, these are not by any means the finite set of characteristics that Christians, and I'll, again refer to myself, ascribe to our concept of a hypothetical God, right? So there are additional things like God would want us to experience joy, and God is all powerful and all knowing. Those are things that we can discuss elsewhere, but they're not germane to the conversation we're having right now. So where does this get us? To answer this, let's go back to Alex's original syllogism and replace one of the not necessarily false premises there with another not necessarily false premise. In this example, it will be the premise of free will. So turning back to Alex's syllogism, we had premise 1. If there is a God, he is perfectly loving. We accepted this, no changes here. Then we turn to premise 2, which is, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant, non-belief does not occur. We accepted this too as not necessarily false, but as discussed, it's not the only potential extension of premise 1, as we'll discuss. And thus, this is why the premise could have been true without necessitating the conclusion. So premise 3 was non-resistant, non-belief does not occur. Again, we accepted this under this set of premises, and we'll accept this again here. Premise 4, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists. Hopefully, it's a bit clearer now why this conclusion isn't necessarily true and thus invalidates the entire syllogism. This could only be necessarily true if it was necessarily true that premise 2 was itself a necessary manifestation of a loving God. But it's not necessary. It's possible, but it's not necessary. I don't require this to be true for my understanding of a Christian God. But if it's not clear, we'll reframe the syllogism after this, and hopefully that will resolve any confusion. So now, reframing the syllogism, we start with premise 1. If there is a God, he is perfectly loving. We'll be a bit more precise here and say the Christian concept of God. So premise 1, if there is the Christian concept of God, he is perfectly loving. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant, non-belief does not occur. Here, we'll replace this premise, again, we already accepted it as possibly true, with another possibly true premise, which is that God imparts humans with free will. So it would read something along the lines of, if a perfectly loving God exists, he would impart humans with free will. Now, this isn't necessarily true either, but again, given that we can't possibly know the true nature of God, we're permitted to entertain any assumptions that are compatible with our notion of a loving God, so long as they are compatible with this world and aren't necessarily false. Premise 3, non-resistant, non-belief does not occur. Again, we accepted this. We'll accept it again as true, but as you can see now, it's no longer having any force in the argument. It's an observation about the world that doesn't necessarily cut against either of the first two premises. Instead, we would restate the premise now as being something along the lines of, as evidence that loving God has imparted humans with free will, we observe the full range of possibilities of people coming to know God given the evidence we have, and that includes within it the possibility of non-resistant non-believers. Then we get to premise 4. And so the conclusion of, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists is now clearly not rendered true by the preceding premises. And instead, now we would say something like, therefore, with respect to belief in God, we see what we would expect to see among the infinite range of belief possibilities. And then premise 5, therefore, our observations are compatible with the Christian concept of God. Non-resistant non-belief is entirely consistent with and even expected by our assumptions about a Christian God. In other words, since I'm able to define a syllogism that is compatible with my notion of a Christian God, that is compatible with other notions of a Christian God, and explains the observation that we have about non-resistant non-believers, I'm not logically required to entertain the argument that the existence of non-resistant non-believers invalidates the possibility of a loving God. In fact, not only am I not required to hold that, I'm not even permitted to. And neither is Alex or Paulogia or anyone else. Now, you might find this unsatisfactory, but remember, if we're framing a syllogism in a way that necessarily invalidates all other possibilities, then that syllogism needs to truly do that. And I hope it's clear now, the syllogisms that we've gotten from Paulogia and Alex do not clearly invalidate all possibilities. The presence of non-resistant non-believers in no way invalidates the possibility of a loving God on the earth that we currently live in the world that we currently occupy. And since it doesn't do that, because the Christian argues that the Christian concept of God imbues humans with the notion of free will, then they're not permitted to say that the presence of non-resistant non-believers forces us to conclude that a God that is loving is incompatible with the current world. As unsatisfactory as it is, they're not even permitted to argue this for themselves. At least not with this logic. Of course, they're entitled to have whatever beliefs they want, but they can't point to logic. They can't point to this syllogism as the basis for it. Under the worldview that I've laid out here, the Christian could easily argue that the non-resistant non-believer is not only part of the world that we currently occupy, where the loving God has imbued us with free will, but it's also expected. And it would be completely consistent with that Christian's worldview to find such people. And again, for many years, I considered myself to be a non-resistant non-believer. That literally was me. And so how do I reconcile this now? I can say that because I can't know God, and the whole premise of this argument is that none of us can know what the reasons are for a loving God to do anything, I feel comfortable postulating any number of ways where this potential change, the change that happened for me, could happen for the non-resistant non-believer. Again, accepting that the non-resistant non-believer is truly what they say they are, which I can, again, completely accept. I'm comfortable saying that on a time frame that is God's time frame, that I don't pretend to understand, and in a manner that's God's manner that I don't pretend to understand either, the non-resistant non-believer may come to find belief in any other number of ways, in any other number of amounts of time. And so I don't struggle with this as some sort of cosmic unfairness, because I don't pretend and can't argue, and no one can, to know exactly why God does anything that God does. What I do trust and where I get peace in my own belief is that God will find a way to reach the person who is truly seeking and is currently not reached, wherever they are. That includes a non-resistant non-believer, and for another conversation for another time, that also includes those who are geographically separated from areas that are far more Christian or Judeo-Christian, God-centric, etc. So to wrap this up, remember, I'm also not arguing that the worldview that I've laid out, that the syllogism that I've presented here, the alternative syllogism that I've laid out here, is the only potentially correct one. But remember, that's not the task. Because the task that the Christian is tasked with here is to explain how can it be possible that we could have a loving God with X condition that we currently see in the world. And so long as I'm able to argue a basis for that is consistent with the world that we currently see, and so long as that argument is not necessarily false, that those premises are not necessarily false, then that's all I'm required or anyone else is required to do here, because the potential things that God could have as characteristics truly is infinity. Now, there are ways to invalidate the syllogism that I've put forth, but you'd have to be able to show that one of those premises is necessarily false. Probably the best candidate for that is free will, and I'm sure, again, Alex will never hear this, Paulogia will probably never hear this, but if they were to hear this, the attack that they would take probably would be on the issue of free will. But I know Alex has already stated that he believed free will is impossible. Again, he's entitled to that belief, but I stand firmly and really resolutely on the position, both from a philosophical standpoint and from a scientific standpoint, that it cannot be demonstrated scientifically that free will is false or doesn't exist. It is completely non-falsifiable. And so I don't have to, and I won't accept that the premise is necessarily false. Again, Alex or anyone else is free to argue that it is, but I don't have to accept that. And that's the point. I'm only required to accept premises that are necessarily true or necessarily false. I'm not required to accept premises that are not necessarily false. I'm also not required or compelled to commit category errors and try to define hypothetical worlds that are entirely different from the natural world that we're in. I don't have to, and I'm not compelled to, try to create a world where there would be no pain or no non-resistant non-belief, or where everybody would have the same access to the Judeo-Christian worldview that I had, that I was biased toward having, admittedly. I'm not obligated to postulate that world. It's an error to force that kind of postulation, because we're not required or compelled to even entertain any of it until we've excluded all of the potential possibilities for the world that we do have. And it's important to remember that there are a number of believers who have found the amount of evidence that we currently do have more than sufficient for them to rest their faith on and assent in the way Paulogia describes. And so I count myself to be in that group. And so, just speaking for myself alone, I am one person who has found what we have to be sufficient in order for me to come to a relationship with the Christian God. And so, even on the issue of fairness, it would go too far to say that the Christian God has not provided enough evidence for people to be able to come to a relationship with him. I've done that, and millions of others have as well, on the evidence set that we currently have. This isn't to say that we are somehow special, but this is exactly what you would expect to find if the Christian God wasn't doing anything to deprive people of coming to know him. In other words, hiding evidence or creating evidence so insufficient that no one could come to know him, and also where that same God imparted humans with free will. We'd expect to see a wide range of people from a wide range of backgrounds coming to find the evidence and the sufficiency of that evidence at different times and with different degrees. We'd expect all of that in a normalized random sample of people created by God. We couldn't argue that it was impossible. And for what it's worth, I find pleasure and joy somewhat peculiarly in the mystery of faith. I truly have come to embrace the mystery of the unknown and unexplained. And at least for me, I've come to be okay with the notion that if there was a hypothetical God and that hypothetical tripartite God sent his son to earth to reveal himself to us in subtle ways and ultimately sacrifice himself for our sins, that such a God would look very much like the God of the New Testament. I cannot know this with certainty, and I'm okay with that. And I'm someone who needed evidence in order to come back to God, and I feel I found it. Again, that's enough for me to say that I leave it to God to find a way to allow the non-resistant non-believer to come to know him according to his infinite wisdom in his infinite time. So I'll wrap up here. I hope this is helpful. Let me know in the comments if you want me to expound on this, or if there are problems you have with it, or anything like that. Again, this is one of those arguments that's pretty tight. I'd say it's fairly airtight, and it's gonna be hard to just willy-nilly poke holes in. You'll have to be really measured and tight with your responses in order to kind of get any ground here. As I've said, I think the strongest point of attack, the most vulnerable point in the argument, is on the premises and demonstrating that one of those premises is necessarily false. I think the best candidate is free will, as I've said, but I think it's going to be really difficult to do, and probably it's not doable. Go ahead and try. Put your stuff in the comments if you have feedback, and thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon. Also, if you can, please like, subscribe, and all that good stuff.